There's this great thing in English that's called the Great Vowel Shift. It's quite the adventure English went on. And if you turn your head and you imagine, I'm going to keep speaking this way to the extent that I can. If you turn your head and you imagine like a side profile of your face, right? Where you pronounce the vowels depends on where your tongue is in the mouth. So you can kind of picture this kind of like sort of trapezoidal area in the mouth where you would pronounce different sounds, right? So English started slowly shifting where we pronounced vowels in the mouth. So the word book, for example, used to be boke, and that's why we spell it to this day with two O's. And what was interesting is when these vowels changed, they started moving into the space of other vowels. And so those vowels had to move. And so this is what's called the chain shift. All of these vowels, like all of the vowels in English, where we pronounce them in the mouth, just kind of rotated. And this is called the Great Vowel Shift.
So is that why we seem to say so many words differently than how they are actually spelled?
Right. Yeah. Other languages have a much clearer correspondence between the letter and the sound. And the really like pretty, I don't know, I think it's kind of hilarious thing about this is this happened right after English spelling kind of got standardized. So the printing press comes in the 1400s. We start printing books. Printers start having standard spellings for words for maybe the first time ever. They start standardizing this stuff. And then the Great Vowel Shift happens and screws it all up.
Is there any kind of a time frame where, generally speaking, after 100 years or 500 years, this language will be completely different, where I wouldn't even recognize English?
If you go back to Old English, it's unrecognizable. The Lord's Prayer in Old English sounds like "Fader uer thuthe out and helfenum." Like like no one understands that. It's totally different. Old English had all sorts of cool like suffixes and prefixes that we don't have anymore. You used to have like 10 different forms of every noun, depending on whether it was the subject or the object or the indirect object, and we lost all that. So it's like totally changed. There was this one linguist, Morris Swadesh, who was very famous, and he had that exact same question. And he thought that you could kind of time how long it took languages to evolve and how far back languages separated from each other by comparing their core vocabulary. And so this is called glottochronology, and it's totally kind of debunked now. It turns out you can't really do that. So like if you look at Icelandic grammar hasn't really changed much in the past 1,000 years. The pronunciation definitely has, but like a lot of the grammatical constructions are pretty much the same. Whereas English, English has been through all sorts of contact with other people and borrowing and things. So English has completely changed. It looks nothing like it did 1,000 years ago. So the pace of change for these two languages is totally different. All of the top most frequent words in English are Germanic origin, but the top 1,000 most frequent words of English, most of them are actually from French or Latin because we've borrowed those words.
Do certain words seem to change less than others over time? Because I would imagine that every language would have a word for fire.
Well, it's interesting you say that because there is this notion of core vocabulary that is more resistant to change. And for a while, it was really speculative. But they recently did some great work actually figuring out, like looking at a bunch of languages and which words were least likely to change over time. And we now have that list. And sure enough, fire is on it. One of those kind of core words is fire. Out of the words, I believe, like mom and milk and water, like land, earth, I think are other good examples of that.